Good morning, everyone from Turin. Good afternoon for all of you, those who are in later hours, and good evening, those who are really in later hours. A pleasure to be with you all, for myself and my colleague Hisham, and of course, our experts who are going to be supporting you for today's session. Primarily, our dear colleague Elisa Benes, of course, who you know very well now from the first week of the course. Of course, we've had a very, very interactive week last week. I know both sessions, the one on analysis and interpretation of the international labor migration data with our colleague Maria was very interesting. I mean, I was not there, but I heard that it was a very, very interactive session from my colleagues. But also the session on Thursday that we covered, of course, with our colleague Nadia Twihri was also very interesting, the one on the population census for statistics on international labor migration, which remains a very, very important source, of course, of labor statistics and of data on labor migration. So, of course, this week is going to be, and actually, so this session and the next couple of sessions, we're going to be always continuing in the sources, talking a little bit about the measurement side again of labor migration. So, of course, they are going to be dense topics technically. We're going to be covering, of course, it's more for those of you who are more concerned with the measurement part of labor migrations, the statistics really part and of the equation. Of course, as you know, we are trying to balance between the analysis and the measurement. This is the whole purpose of the training. So in the beginning, we had some sessions, of course, with Theo and with other colleagues on a little bit talking about the priority data needs for labor migration policy and analysis. But of course, we also have to cover the concrete sources of data that are, of course, that we need to understand, even if you're not a statistician per se, it's important to understand what are the sources of data, what are the limitations, what are the advantages, what they can provide you in terms of data, and of course, how, even if you're a user, from a user perspective, how you can use this data, obviously, to make a better analysis of labor migration. So this is the logic on which we design the training. So of course, very happy to welcome back Elisa. Elisa today is going to be covering household surveys to measure international labor migration. And then, of course, on Thursday, also with our dear colleague Peter Buembo, who is the regional statistician of the ILO in South Asia, we're going to be covering the one measurement, of course, in household surveys, which is the SDG 10.7.1, which is one more concerned with migrant recruitment cost. We are going to be talking about that, about measuring migrant recruitment cost with Peter. However, today, to set the scene really and to talk a little bit about one of the main sources of data, in this case, the household surveys to measure international immigration, we are going to be having a very, very important session with Elisa. I've been very happy with the interaction and the training. We've had an amazing group of participants so far. There's been a lot of conversations, exchanges, questions, and comments, interventions. I hope we will continue with this spirit. Very happy also with the participation rate of the training in terms of the live webinars. We are now in the fourth week and still we are getting very, very good averages of attendance. And I do hope this will always be the case because attending the live webinars is really crucial. We understand that it can be challenging for some of you, particularly those in the Americas, when it's very, very challenging hours. However, this is a minority because the bulk of our participants is in Asia and the Pacific and some in Europe. So hopefully all of you will be able to maintain the attendance rates until the end of the training. One last thing, indeed, is as again a reminder that I hope groups are progressing on the group project. We are going to be in touch with you, with my colleague Roseanne on that via email to make sure that groups are progressing in the best way possible. We did get an inquiry from one group about the presentation timing and the hour. Of course, as you know, the group projects, the presentation should happen on the 11th of December at 8 in the morning. The idea is to have everyone present in the same time for maximum benefit and for peer-to-peer exchange mostly. We, of course, we will explore if there is a need to revisit this. However, for now, please note that the idea is to have everyone presenting together, again, for all of us to learn from one another and to see how each group have approached the group project. So I do hope that this is going to be feasible for everybody. And in any case, we are going to be in touch with all of you group by group via email. I don't want to talk any further. I know we have a lot of content to cover with Elisa. I thank you all for your active participation, and I pass the floor right away to Elisa. Thank you very much, Elisa, in advance for your support.
Thank you, Mostafa, for giving such a good introduction and background to how this session today connects to the rest of the course agenda. So it's a pleasure for me to be back again with you today. I have been hearing from colleagues that you're asking all these questions, that you make them even reflect things that they were not thinking about. So thank you for that. It really helps us also know that we have these exchanges and that you kind of bring up new things that we really need to consider when we are addressing these topics. So as Mostafa said, I will talk today about household surveys and how they can be a main source for statistics on international labor migration. Let me share my screen. What I'll try to do is I'll be going through the slides, but I'll be stopping in between elements of the presentations, so that if you have questions or any comments or reactions, you are more than welcome to bring them up at that point. As I'm presenting, just for my colleagues, I don't see the chat. So if somebody raises hand, please do let me know. And the idea is not to let me just talk for a whole hour, but to break at little points so you can ask questions or raise points, and I can clarify a few things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elisa.
So I'm going to give a little bit of background of why national household or individual surveys are an important source for statistics on international labor migration. And here we're focusing on sample surveys, like major national household or individual sample surveys based on probability theory. So we're looking at really core official statistics for labor force statistics. We're going to talk about some of the quality considerations that we need to think about when we're using surveys to address topics of migration, not just labor migration, but migration in general. And we'll talk about what those quality considerations mean in terms of the design of the surveys, what we need to be keeping in mind. And then we're going to look through more of the questionnaire design and looking at really how, through a household survey, we can capture information, we can identify the different groups of migrants that are relevant for international labor migration statistics, what items we need to collect in a survey to match those definitions. This is coming from the definitions that we saw in the very first substantive session where we looked at the international standards. And then we'll look at some sample questions of how would you translate those concepts and data items into survey questions that can be integrated. And all of this is based on the work that we do at the ILO supporting countries to implement surveys and to adapt their surveys to capture labor migration topics. So this is all that I'm sharing with you is survey designs that have been tested, validated, developed with countries, and that are actually running in a number of countries. So why national household surveys can be important for international labor migration statistics? As you know, most countries use national representative household surveys as one of their core sources of official statistics for information about the population of a country. A very well known for labor statistics is labor force survey. These are national household surveys that countries run on a regular basis, but there are others. There's the household budget survey, working conditions survey, surveys of living conditions. There are many kinds of surveys, and so they're a core source that countries are implementing to capture information about their population. They are based on probability sampling methods, and these are already quite developed methods that use sampling theory to make sure that a survey that only asks information about a small proportion of the population can generate estimates that are representative of the larger population. So maybe a survey will capture, will have a sample size of 10,000, let's say, but the population is 1 million. So that means about a 1% sampling rate. That's fairly typical. And how do we make sure that those 10,000 people that we have in our household survey are actually representative of the larger population? So that's based on these probability sampling methods. And this also allows us, because we have sampling methods based on standard methodologies, allows us to calculate the sampling error. And this is a measure that tells us how reliable or precise our estimates are. How sure can I be that the number I'm getting is really a good, precise number? And they're usually targeting the population that lives in private households. And for statistics that deal with labor topics, this is quite important, because it doesn't matter if the person has a formal or an informal job, if it's a casual or short-time job. It doesn't matter if it's a job in a household or in an enterprise. We will capture them because we go to their private households. We are not going through an enterprise. It's not an administrative source that might miss some populations. So that's why they're particularly strong for labor statistics. They're flexible. We can design them as we need to cover different topics depending on the objectives of the survey. This is also, we have more flexibility than we would have in a administrative source that is specific to the procedure that needs that administrative process. And so here we have the flexibility to design them depending on what we want to measure. And of course, when they're part of the regular official program of statistics, then they're usually well established with a frequency that is quite regular. So we know that we can compare results over time and look at trends. And this is quite common for labor for service. Many countries are running labor for service on a continuous basis, and they're producing quarterly estimates or annual estimates. And so when that's the case, we have really a good tool that can be a source for statistics on international labor migration. Now, what is the challenge when we're trying to deal with the topic of migration? So we have our population, but the international migrants are usually relatively small compared to the general population in countries. Of course, this can vary depending on whether the country is a migrant receiving country or a migrant sending country. The share of the foreign-born population can be fairly small. Most migrant sending countries will have shares of immigrants that come to their country, a smaller proportions. They still come to the country, but their smallest proportions can be less than 1%, so really, really small. And when we go to countries that are mostly receiving countries, then we're talking 20 to 30%. In some cases, maybe more Gulf countries, then we are really talking about the majority of population. But for the vast majority, they tend to be in the range of less than 10%. So that makes them fairly small compared to the general population that a survey would be targeting. Now, in terms of other groups, for example, when we're interested in return migrants, we don't actually know what's the percentage of the population that have lived abroad, that have experienced living abroad and haven't gone back to the countries. So this is really an area where there's not sufficient data to say it's in the range of 5%. We know for some countries can be 8 or 10%. Those are usually countries with high emigration and return migration, so house circularity, then they can have those levels, but we just don't have a global picture. So one challenge is they are relatively small compared to the general population in most countries. Usually migrants, and in the case of immigrants, we're talking about populations that are not living across the country and distributed across the country on an equal basis. They're usually concentrated in particular regions. They'll be concentrated in regions where the main industries where they find employment are located. And this can be for mining, for agriculture, for construction, tourism. They will also settle in new built areas or border areas or export processing zones. So we know there are certain areas within countries where migrants concentrate, certain neighborhoods. It's not across the country. We also know that in many times, especially for migrant workers, they will live in employer-provided accommodation or collective living quarters. These can be worker camps, for example, in mining or in agriculture, in construction, they might be on site. They can be also an employer-provided accommodation, for example, in fishing or in tourism. Or they could also be in boarding houses and hostels, living as groups of unrelated adults and not as family units in private households. So that means that household surveys, which are usually targeting private conventional households, may miss important groups of migrant workers, especially those in collective quarters. And we also have special populations, for example, refugees that might live in also government provided housing or camps, and they can also fall out of the scope of household surveys. With return migrants, we also know that they depart from their origin communities, and oftentimes on return, they might not go back to their origin communities. They might go to other centers for employment, depends on the country and the type of migration. But when this happens, also means that we don't really know where to target them, because they might not be going to the places that we know are departing from. So all of these kind of challenges mean that migrants in household surveys are considered a hard to reach group. That means that we just need to do more special designs and considerations when we're designing a survey to be able to make sure that they are included, that they're part of the surveys in a way that we can generate good quality statistics. So they're not like the typical general population. They do have their particular characteristics. That means design has to take this into account in a survey. So what kind of options we have for surveys to generate statistics on international labor migration? We can say that there are two broad kinds for the national representative surveys. We can have specialized migration surveys, or we can have a module that we add to another established household survey. The ideal, of course, is to have a specialized migration survey. Why? Because these surveys are specifically designed to target migrant populations. So they take into consideration where they live, the type of living arrangements that they have, their size in the population, to make a survey that will make sure that they are included and in sufficient numbers so we can make good estimates. So we can also, because they're specialized on migration, then they include detailed questions on migration as we need them. So that gives them the particular value. Now, what's the big challenge with specialized migration surveys? Oftentimes, they're not part of a statistical program of the country. So oftentimes, they're not funded regularly. They are depending on finding donors or interested parties that would fund the survey. And so that really impacts their sustainability and the reliability that you have a survey that will run every few years to be able to look at trends over time. So one of the biggest challenges, we did an assessment of country practices in 2023, and we found out that only about 16% of the countries that we included, and we included most of the countries in the world, had a specialized migration survey running in the previous 10 years. So we know they are not common because they're not yet integrated into statistical programs. And when they are conducted, oftentimes they are targeting the migrant population and they don't include non-migrants. So that means that even when we have a lot of information about migrants, we cannot compare it to the non-migrant population. And that impacts the value of the data to be able to assess the relative situation and try to address gaps and differences with the non-migrant population. Now, the alternative is including a module, a migration module, in another well-established household survey in the country. Now, this, of course, if the survey is already well-established and well-integrated, that means that we have sustainability. This can be efficient because the survey is already running. So it means that we can have regular statistics that we can look at trends. What's the challenge? That oftentimes a general household survey is not thinking about making sure that they can produce estimates of migrants. So we have to assess the design of the survey, potentially the sample size, and make adjustments to make sure that they're covering well the migrant population. That's one of the biggest challenges. The second biggest challenge is, of course, that we can only add a few questions to identify migrants or on topics that are specific to migrants. That's because the survey is already running for a general topic that it's the priority of the survey. So we cannot really come and add too many other questions because then we impact also the quality of the general survey. So there's a trade-off between what is the better option. One of the other values of course, having a module in another household survey is that then we can compare for some headline indicators or headline statistics, the situation of migrants and non-migrants. So these are two alternatives. Each one has its pro and its con. The ideal situation is that a country has a strategy that includes both. Is a specialized migration survey that goes in detail, let's say once or twice a year in a 10-year cycle, and a special and a module on a household survey that is major for the relevant topics that are important in the country, that produces a few headline indicators relevant to the survey, for example, on a more frequent basis. And that we see in some countries, but they'll have a few questions to identify migrants in their labor force survey, for example, so they can do headline indicators of the labor force participation rate, employment and unemployment, and some headline statistics on a frequent basis. And then usually after the population census or in the intercensal decade, so 5 years after the population census, they'll have a specialized migration survey that provides more detailed information about this population in particular. So ideally, both are valuable, but these are the options that a country would have. Now, what about a labor force survey as the parent survey for these modules? So there are, of course, many advantages because this is a survey that is mostly established around countries. Of course, in some countries, it's not yet a regular survey. When that is the case, nevertheless, it's a priority survey to establish. So as the statistical system gets stronger, this is one of the core surveys that the countries are running. We have it usually with a frequent implementation, so we know there's that ability to follow trends. They are generally large sample sizes because there's interest in producing labor market indicators at subnational levels by urban, rural, or broad regions. So already they tend to be quite large in terms of sample compared to, for example, a household budget survey. And they're closely related in topics to the interest in terms of labor migration because they're already covering the labor market characteristics of the population. So there's a lot of advantages there. In fact, it's not just that there are advantages, there's also an important aspect that labor market statistics should consider the migrant characteristics of the population. Why? Because in countries where migrants are part of the labor of particular industries, they actually have a contribution to production, to employment in the country. So it's important that we capture that for the economic statistics as well, but also because they impact the dynamics of the labor market. Usually migrants will have different ways of reacting to when there's a downtime cycle. So they'll have their own trends in terms of unemployment, in terms of underutilization. And so it's important that we take it into account in our headline labor market indicators. It's also an important recognition for return migrant workers that they be part of the surveys identified in the surveys on labor force, because we need to have that information on their skills, on their experience abroad, to be able to look at how to bring them back and reintegrate them into the labor market in the origin countries. So there's a lot of advantages, there's challenges, of course, but there's a lot of value and advantages in looking at how a labor force survey can support integration of modules on migration. Of course, biggest challenge is checking that the design, that the sample size, that the location of the migrants is really well represented in the design of the survey. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So we've talked about the types of surveys that can be important for generating statistics on labor migration, and some of the pros and cons, and why labor force surveys are important, not only because it's a main survey, but because it deals with labor, and migrants are part of the labor of the country, or return migrants are a group that brings in skills, resources, and so then we need information for their reintegration policies. But what about quality considerations? We talked that migrant populations are difficult, hard to reach for surveys. So let's talk about how do we look at the quality of data in a household survey. We have what is called a total error. So as we said, a survey estimate is an approximation of what we think is a true value in the population, because we don't see everybody like in a population census. We enumerate everybody. In a survey, we just take a small group. So then from there, we say, okay, how good is my estimate based that I'm only looking at this sample and not at everybody? And so that estimate has some errors associated with it. We have the sampling error, which is our error of variability because we take a sample. So this usually is a random error and just tells us how precise we are. And then we have non-sampling errors. These are errors that come for other reasons. We can have errors because of coverage. So we miss people. And this is an issue, for example, when we apply the survey only to households and we have migrants that are living in group camps or in refugee camps, then we have a cover error because we did not include this population. So they're falling out of our coverage. If we were intending to include them, then they're out, then we don't have that representation there. We can have errors of non-response, for example, where we knock on the households that we selected and the person is not there because they are, that period of time they are away, or because we go at a time when they are in the office and the work and they are not in the house, or because they're worried that they don't want to answer, so they don't answer the door. So we have problems of non-response. We have problems of measurement error. Maybe we ask a question and the person does not quite understand what we mean, so they answer something else. They interpret the question differently, or they are concerned with giving us the true answer, and so they tell us something else that they feel a bit more comfortable with. So we can have measurement error. It can come from the questionnaire. It can come because maybe we send them a written questionnaire and they have problems understanding. With migrants, it might be the language. We're using a language that is not well understood. It's not their language. Or it can be an error because of the interviewer or the respondent interaction. So we also can have, we collect the data and then we can have errors in processing. Maybe we enter the data incorrectly, and so we have a processing error. So there are all kinds of other errors that can happen that can add to and impact the quality of our surveys. When these errors are not random and we have a systematic, so migrants are more likely to not answer, or are more likely to misunderstand the questions, or are more likely to fall out because they're living in collective quarters and we miss them, then we have a systematic error that introduces bias. And this is when our data has a problem. So as we say in a survey, a sampling error gives us problems with precision. Maybe our estimate is not so precise because we don't have enough migrants that we interviewed, so we don't have sufficient precision. Or it can be not accurate or biased because we missed a particular group, the migrant workers that are in camps, or we did not answer the migrants whose language is not similar to the language of the country, or and this adds bias when it's systematic. So these are important issues to consider because they can impact more the migrant population when we use surveys. So ideally, what we want to have is a survey that is targeting well the migrants' populations and has procedures in the field that facilitates their participation. And so we would have a precise and unbiased estimate. That means we're really targeting what we want to measure and we have good data. That would be our ideal dream. Usually this requires a specialized survey that is designed for them. What often happens is that we use a survey that we haven't really thought about how migrants are covered, or introduce procedures that help them participate. And so we end up with a number, but that number is imprecise and is probably biased. So this is the issue with surveys, that we really have to take account of design issues to make sure we have good quality data. Otherwise, we have data, but maybe it's just not good quality. And so therefore, our interpretations, our assumptions, our decisions for policy can be impacted and not as effective. Just an example, I do give you, when you get the documents from the platform, the course platform, you will have more information on definitions and aspects about these issues about the survey error. But to give you an illustration, this is data from a country that had introduced a module in the labor force survey to be able to produce headline labor market indicators by native foreign born, so identifying the immigrant population in the country. And these are the basic tabulations for working age population, for the employed population, for the unemployed, by native foreign born status and by sex. And so just to read it, and so we have the total estimate, that's the estimated value that the survey came up with. And then we have some measures of quality, the standard error, the confidence interval, the margin of error, and the relative standard error. These are important measures of quality for the part on the sampling errors. And so, for example, if we look at the total at the top, working age population that are foreign born, let's look at the foreign born. In this country, they were estimated to be around 83,800 persons, with a almost fairly even distribution between male and female, more males than females, but more or less distributed similarly. We have their standard error. We have let's look at the foreign born female is 37,700 persons with a standard error of around 2,500, and with a confidence interval. So 95% confidence that the true value falls between 32,900 and 42,600. So we know that that's the range in which the actual value of the population of foreign-born women of working age in this country is. So our relative standard error, meaning how wide is the size of that variance compared to our estimate, it's around 6%. That usually is a good estimate. So when we look at working age population, they were good. But once we go, and we see for most of the estimates, the relative standard errors are fairly low. Usually anything below 20% is considered acceptable quality, below 5%, very good quality, and so on. But if it's above 20%, then we start having problems with quality. If it's above 30%, it's not usable, because then we think it's too wide. And so we can look at the very bottom at the unemployed estimate for foreign-born women. Foreign-born women that are unemployed were estimated at 1,053 women. And we have our standard error, we have our confidence intervals. So the confidence intervals are telling us we're 95% confidence that the true value is between 231 women and 1,881 women that are unemployed, that are foreign. Now that's a very wide spread, no? Not knowing if it's 231 or 1,800 makes a big difference for policy, for the relevance and so on. So we know that estimate is not precise. And we can see it, our relative standard error is 40%. We could not use this estimate as quality. So, and this is only for the unemployed. If we wanted to look by age, by education level, and so on, we just would not be able to do any further disaggregations. So this shows what happens when you introduce a module into a general household survey. You can get some very high level indicators with some quality, but once you want to get into more detailed characteristics or groups that are small, like the unemployed, then you just don't have the quality for the foreign-born population. So that's one of the implications. Then we have limited use of the data for more detailed analysis. An example of coverage error, and this is, as I said, when we have problems that we did not include well certain groups of the population in the coverage, so the estimates are not as good for those populations and they can be biased. The way we assess that is by comparing the estimates that come from the survey to an external source, a benchmark. That's usually our benchmark, and usually that could be the population census, for example. So here they compare the age-sex structure of the population by race, non-Black and Black, and the age groups, male and female, and they compare the number that came up for that age category, age, sex category, and race to the estimate that the population census generates. And if it's a ratio, so if it's 1, that means that is 1-to-1 ratio, so it's exactly very good estimate. It came up very close to the census. Anything below, we have an under coverage. Anything above 1, it's an over coverage. So where do we see the biggest problem here? It's in this group. So we know that the survey of the US that is covering, and this is not migration specifically, but it was a way to show you what happens with undercoverage. This was the current population survey, which is the labor force survey of the US. In this period, this is already somewhat old, the data was showing that for Black men in the age groups 20 to 29 and 30 to 39, the survey really has an undercoverage. So estimates about this population can be biased because it was really only capturing about 0.6 of that population. So really a significant undercoverage. So these are the kind of issues that we can have if the survey is not well designed for particular populations, in this case, migrants. Mustafa?
Hi, Lisa.
Sure.
Maybe we can take a second just to make sure that everybody's following. Of course, I'm aware that these are very deeply technical concepts, but of course, those of you who are statisticians or have worked with this before, you might be familiar. But just making sure that everything is clear. We do have a question from my good friend Ali from Morocco. So the question is, do you recommend publishing figures with a high coefficient of variation, relative standard error, for example, 40%, even if they can be more misleading than informing?
That's a very good question, and thank you for asking. We would not recommend publishing results above 30%. Maybe if you're in the borderline between 20 and 30%, we would say put an asterisk and a caution that this estimate is the quality is not good, and then above percent we wouldn't recommend using.
Indeed, thank you, Lisa. Also, our participant Rita is asking, so I'm analyzing some indicators for international migrants for a specific country based on the HS socio-demographic and economic surveys. And in many cases, there are only values for non-migrants, while for migrants, there are no values there are not values, and they say it's unreliable. The values are unreliable. What is exactly the meaning of this?
That's exactly similar to what I was just explaining, that they made an assessment of the standard errors and the relative standard errors associated with the estimates for the migrants, and they realized they were too high to be used. They were just not reliable, meaning that the margins of error around the estimate are too wide for you to be able to say this is useful. So that's why they are saying this is not a reliable estimate. We cannot use it for that level of disaggregation and comparisons. And it's precisely what I showed you. They probably had a coefficient of variation that was too high. And usually the standard procedure is above 20%. You put an asterisk saying this is not, this is of use with caution, let's say, and then above 30%, you don't publish. Now that can vary for very rare topics and rare things, but the standard in official statistics is more or less like that. Above 20%, below 30%, you put that is cautions, and then above 30%, you don't publish. So
thank you, Lisa.
That means, in practice, this means that if they were getting at the end of the day, probably less than 13 cases of people that would fall in that category. So with so few cases, this is the sample size. So few cases, you just cannot put an estimate that is good.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Rita, for the question. We have another question from Angela. So, quoting, are there tools to determine which factors actually contribute to the standard of errors? This might assist countries in focusing on which factors to focus on.
Definitely. So when a survey is designed, usually they specify the measurement objectives, and they say, for example, for a labor force survey, they will say, we want this survey to provide us reliable estimates of unemployment at the district level or the region level by urban rural. And so they'll decide that is the level of precision we want. They'll use an estimate that is usually smaller than the general population. So for example, the unemployment rate, and they'll say, we want to have a good estimate of unemployment rate at the region level by sex, let's say. And then they'll use that to develop a sample that will reach that level of precision. And this is, there are formulas, there's a whole methodology to estimate what is the minimum sample size that you need to reach a precision on a given estimate. Now that is used, the issue is when you want to do it for migrants, then you have to, in addition, consider the share of migrant population in the country and where they are located. If that's not taken into account, then even if you estimated, you designed your survey to give you that estimate with that level of precision, you will not get it for migrants because they tend to be small population, they tend to be in different locations and so on. But there are methodologies for, this is what a sampling statistician will do. The methodologies that designs the survey, this is what they do.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Angela. Any other questions at this stage, dear participants? Of course, also you can take the microphone if you have any comments. One question came from our participant, Jama, from Somalia. So the question is, how can we sample migrants in a labor force survey if there are few migrants in the country? They are spread out. They have, for example, they have jobs and they live in rent homes in distant geographic locations.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Usually we have a design that you have a frame, for example, your population census or an administrative record. And the way you deal with, the population is spread everywhere, right? So populations can be all over the country and so on, but you divide your frame by regions, for example, and then within regions you cluster and you select at different stages clusters and so on. So there's a strategy for sampling that allows you to manage cost while making sure that you are including people from different parts of your country. So you do something similar, but then you add, as part of your sampling design, the concentration of migrants in those regions, and then you select a few samples for those areas. So you have, for example, your enumeration areas or your clusters, and you say, okay, in this region, I have this many population, and then you have what proportion of migrants are there, and then you select regions with more migrants. We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to go into sampling design because it's more technical, but I'll give you a sense of the tools that exist to address that.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you, Jama, indeed, for a very pertinent questions. Well, all the questions are quite relevant. I do not see other questions at the moment, and I know we still have some content to go through. So maybe, Elisa, we can continue and we take another round in shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, precisely. I wanted to talk these issues about sampling just before we go to the questions. So thank you. So let me go to the design considerations. So, a standard consideration for the labor force survey is usually they're targeting the private households only. The design is multi-stage, precisely this. So we have a frame and we first select regions, for example, and then within regions we select clusters or areas, and within that we select households, and so it's multi-stage. They're stratified by region, so that means that we make sure that we can include people from all the regions, and within that we select clusters, so that we reduce cost of travel because if we just select individuals all over the country, we will be driving everywhere. So the way we do it is we select areas, and then within areas we select clusters, and that way we make sure all of the countries covered, but targeted, so that we can concentrate our travel costs to go to those areas. This is for surveys that are in person. For that, we need a listing. We need a listing of our population. And these listings usually come from the population census or from a register. This may be updated regularly or not. Imagine if a population census is every 10 years and we don't update the listing, that means that by year 6, 7, and 8, we already have a quite old listing or frame that we use. But we calculate our sample size based on the indicators that we want to estimate with a level of precision, like the unemployment rate. We want the unemployment rate to be precise at less than, say, 5% relative standard error. And then this is what we take into account. And then we usually have standard operations where we train our interviewers to deliver on general labor topics. If you want to consider integrating migration as a topic, then you need to think about the characteristics of your migrant population. If you're interested in return migrants, they're mostly residing in your private households. So your design is okay so long as you make sure that you look at where return migrants are going in your region and you make sure they're included in this design. If you're looking at foreign-born, then consider if the foreign-born population might be living outside private households, because then you have to consider, how do I make sure those areas are also included? So you have to look for what options you have for identifying the distribution, the location, and the numbers of migrants in your country, whether they're foreign-born or they're return migrants or households that have immigrant members. And then you have to decide what the expected number of migrants is in my population, so I can set my precision levels. And then you have to consider also in your field operations that you need to have training for languages maybe, or training for reducing sensitivity. Maybe you need some campaigns to promote participation, and you know, this kind of sensitivity issues, so that their migrants are willing to participate in your survey. So one example of the methods that you have to improve your sample design, and it depends on what information you have in your country, but often you'll have some information, so you can use it different ways. Best is your population census. As you know, most of the population census include the questions to identify the foreign-born populations, or the households that have immigrant members, or the persons that have ever lived abroad, so you have your return migrants. This information in your census is essential, is exactly what you need to know where they are, because your population census has information on the geography, right? So your sample frame for surveys comes from your population census, and if you have your areas with information about how many people that are foreign-born, how many households with immigrants, or how many persons with previous residence abroad live in the different geographic areas of my country, then that's exactly what you need to target your survey, because this information, then you use it in your sampling. If you don't have a population census recently, or these questions were not included, then you can also look at administrative sources. You might have registers of foreign residents, or you might have a list of migrants that have been issued work permits. Maybe this is not all of the types of migrants, but this information can help you. If it comes with geography of where the persons live, then you can merge this information with your enumeration area information from your population census, and you can use that to target the areas. And if not, you can set up a group of experts that discusses what are the areas of concentration where you know that migrants are living there or are arriving to those areas, and you can give a ranking of priority. These areas are areas where we have high likelihood of finding migrants. These areas have less likelihood, and you can do a ranking that helps you target your survey. And so these are ways that you can make sure that your sampling frame to select your sample for your survey includes information about where we can find migrants. And the idea is that you're going to oversample those areas or households where there's higher proportions of migrants. So you have usually this multi-stage design. So at the first stage, you're going to be selecting areas. So imagine you have your country and you have to come up with a way to select a small sample, but that represents everybody. So you first select areas. That's the first stage selection. Usually these are called primary sampling units. And then there you look at those that have concentration of migrants. If they have higher concentration of migrants, you give them higher chances of being in the sample. And at the second stage, you're within the area. So now you're looking at within the area, selecting households, let's say. And then again, you can assign higher probabilities to households that have migrants. So these are the standard methods that exist for sampling statisticians to design a survey or improve the coverage of migrants in those surveys. So these are standard procedures. They're not unique. They're not different. It's just they take account of the migrant population characteristics. Labor force surveys already do this for levels of education or income of the country, because they want to make sure that they capture the population make sure that it's representative for low income or middle income or high income or low education, mid education, high education of the population. So these strategies are already used and they just need to be applied to the migrant population in terms of their concentration in different areas. If there's none of these, then there are other methods that are a little bit more experimental. But already for sampling statisticians, the tools exist there to be able to take into account migrants in their designs. So that's for the persons that are designing, or if you are requesting a survey to say, I want to make sure that the survey takes better account of migrants, then there are strategies for it. So this is what I wanted to say. This was the time when we could break. So maybe before we go to looking at data of survey questionnaire design, I can stop here. Mustafa, in case there were any remaining questions, because they were very linked to the previous round of questions.
Indeed, no, I mean, I was just about to write that. I hope everything was clear regarding the mixed sampling methods. I don't see a question right now, but of course, dear participants, if you have any regarding the previous section, please post it in the chat or also raise your hand and make a microphone intervention if there was anything not clear, if anything you have a doubt on. So
yeah.
Otherwise, if everything was perfectly clear,
I know this is a little bit more technical for sure, and it's something that does require basically its own course to look at sampling. So, but I just want to give you the intuitive idea that if the survey is not designed for this population, because usually they're small, then usually you're going to have quality problems from the survey. You can find that by looking at your sampling errors, your coefficients of variations, your coverage comparisons with another source like the census. And so from the analysis side, you can see the problems if there are problems. And from the design side, you can know that there are standard sampling techniques that exist. And so that you can go with the sampling experts in your countries and say, we need to take account of this.
Absolutely, Nana. It's important also to highlight that, but of course we are not covering sampling per se. That's a full other course, as Elisa knows. I do not see questions. I believe we can move on to the priority groups, Elisa, if you do
right.
not mind.
So thank you. So that's one thing is the design, and the other is how do we actually identify them in our questionnaires. And so we can design household or individual survey questionnaires to capture different groups. We can capture, thinking about surveys are targeting our population living in the country, so the resident population. We can have questions designed to capture the immigrants, so those foreign-born or that are in the country. We can have survey questions to identify return migrants because they're part of the resident population. They've come back, they're living in the country in households, so we can identify them. We can also ask questions about the immigrants that have left, but not all of them, because immigrants are not living in the country. So in a survey, we don't find them, but we find the households that stay behind. So we can ask questions to the households whether they had members that left and are living abroad. It's not the whole group, because if the full household emigrated, there's nobody there to report them. But at least for those where there's a household left behind, then we can ask them questions, so we can have some measures of immigrants that have ties to the country. And we can also capture through a household survey or individual survey the residents that are working abroad. Again, because they're residents, they're usually short-term workers that go abroad and then come back to the country.
Excuse me? Are you trying to ask something, please? No.
No.
Please, everybody, keep your microphones always on mute unless you would like to make an intervention. Sorry, Elisa, for stopping you.
So the usual groups, so for most of the groups, we can use surveys that are targeting the residents in households through in a survey. The one group that is difficult is the non-residents that are coming just for short periods at a time. Those you really need to do very special designs if you want to capture statistics about them on a survey. But for the other groups that are resident in the country or that have households remaining in the country, then we can ask questions about them. So household surveys, flexible design, similar to the census. You can capture all of the essential characteristics, but then you can go into more details. So we capture their sociodemographics, age, sex, education level, marital status, importantly, country of birth, country of citizenship. Those are essential. We can capture characteristics of their migration, in particular, whether they have ever resided abroad or whether they're currently residing abroad for the former household members. But we can also go into more details compared to a census. And I'm assuming in the census session, you saw already these questions and these topics. Of course, for labor force and for employment, for immigrants, those who are living in the country, you can ask all of the questions about their labor force status, labor underutilization, and all the characteristics. For the return migrants and immigrant household members, you want to, in addition to also know their employment abroad. So then you ask questions about their last employment abroad or the current employment abroad. And we have all the priority topics that we need for characterizing their employment, their occupation, their branch of economic activity, their status in employment, information about their contract characteristics, informal employment, working hours, earnings, duration of employment, and very important for the topic of migration, recruitment, how they found the job, how they were recruited, if they were recruited, and if they paid any cost. And that will be the focus of the next session. You will go more in detail into the measurement of recruitment. Cost
Elisa,
and channels. Yes.
there is a direct question, but just maybe we can just quickly, if you could clarify what is meant by country of birth.
Country of birth is so maybe you should, I would hope that you saw this at the population census, in the population census. The country of birth is the country where the person was born, and most specifically, it focuses on the usual place of residence of the mother at the time of the birth. So generally, you ask them, where were you born? But for countries where women tend to travel to deliver, then you want to make the clarification, where was the mother living at the time of the birth? And that's the country of birth. Usually it's captured as place of birth, so you capture more detail, but you have to, of course, make sure that you're capturing the country.
Thank you, Elisa. We did cover it in the census, but it's good to repeat. Thank you, Elisa.
Okay, so it's a basic characteristic. It allows you to identify the native-born and the foreign-born population, and this is a basic distinction to identify international migrant status. And the country of birth is similar. The country of citizenship is the alternative criterion. It's also important because then you see the legal rights that the person has in the country. And this can be one country or multiple countries of citizenship. That should have said countries of citizenship. So let me look back again. I'm going to remind us of some of the definitions that we saw in the first session. Maybe you saw them again with the census. So if we are looking at capturing, developing questions for immigrants in the labor force, which are the persons that are foreign-born or foreign citizens if the countries are using country of citizenship criterion, of working age that are resident in the country who at a specified point in time were in the labor force. Remember, as employed or unemployed. So what kind of data items we need in our survey? We need to know, confirm that they're usual resident in the country. We need to know their country of birth or place of birth. We need to know their country of citizenship. And we need to know their labor force status in the reference period. This is standard, the way it's measured in labor force statistics, whether they're employed in the reference week, whether they're unemployed, based on job search, desire, and availability. These are the minimum. The red is the minimum. The black ones are also important because if you get the date of arrival, then we also know if they're recent immigrants or they've been there for the country for a long time. And the reason for migration can give you a little bit more analytical value. And of course, the characteristics of the job that are essential to see where the employed are contributing, in which occupations, in which industries, in what status in employment. So let's look at the questions that we use to identify these groups. Of course, when we're looking at migration, place of birth, citizenship, we would ask them to everybody, regardless of age. So that way you can see also the foreign-born population or foreign citizen population, including children. But once when you go to the questions about occupation or employment, then it's above 15 age, the working age. Your country might have a different working age, but we try to recommend that it not be above 15. So important, so we asked them whether the person was born in the country or not. If it was born in the country, then we can check on the citizenship, whether they're citizens of the country or of another country. That's MIG 6. And we can also identify those who don't have any citizenship, so they are stateless. If the person says that they were not born in the country, then we capture the name of the country, when they arrived to live in the country, and how, and if they don't recall the dates, then how long have they been living? So we can at least get an approximation. And then they continue to the question on citizenship, and for the foreign-born to also know if they are citizens of the country or in another country, and the name of the country that they're citizens of. So this is a standard sequence for capturing place of birth, country of citizenship, and year period of arrivals. And this is your standard one that you can have in your population census. It can be similar to your labor force survey or your specialized migration survey. Then you can have a question on reason for move. Here, what is important is to distinguish reasons that are work-related versus other types of reasons for labor migration statistics, of course. And you can distinguish between those who are starting a new job, a job transfer, or who are going to look for a job. And this gives you a little bit more analytical power. Now, the main reason might not be the only reason, or that persons who also move for studies or for marriage can also go into the labor force, but this just gives you analytical information about what was the main reason for coming to the country. And of course, you can also have reasons related to forced displacement. Again, the reason for move will not find everybody who has been forcibly displaced, who has come to the country. So you need additional questions, but it gives you some analytical starting point. So once you have the migration questions captured, the essential ones to identify the foreign-born or foreign citizen population, then you need your questions on labor force status. And this is a questionnaire sequence flow from the minimum set of questions you need to identify the labor force status. So you need to know whether they work for pay or profit in the reference period. And if they say they didn't, then you have to ask them a recovery question, because many people don't report casual jobs or informal jobs with the first question. So you have to ask them if they did anything else. And if they say no, then you ask them about job search availability, so you can identify the unemployed. If they said yes to any of the work for pay or profit questions, then you can identify them as employed, and then you capture their employment characteristics. So what is important here for foreign-born populations, but also for your general population, is the recovery questions, because we often miss persons with small jobs, informal jobs, contributing family workers, or domestic workers. So I'm going to show you the sample minimal questions. Usually you can have much longer sequences, but here I just want to highlight what is essential. That you ask them in the reference period. Employment is usually measured with reference to a week. So the last week, did you do any of the following? Did you work for someone else for pay? Did you work in your own family or farming or fishing, family business? Did you work in any other kind of business activity, or none of these? If they work for somebody else for pay, then you know they are in employment, so they can go straight to the questions about occupation and so on. If they work in their own family or fishing or farming, then you need to check if what they're producing is for sale or for consumption. If it's for sale, then we know it's market-oriented self-employment, so they are employed. If they're producing only for own consumption, then we capture some characteristics about their own consumption production, but they're not considered in employment because this is not market-oriented self-employment, it's production for own final use. So then we ask to everybody who said no to any work for profit or business activity, and to those who are producing for final use. Last week, did you do anything else to generate income, even for 1 hour? And then here you can use examples: casual work, odd jobs, making things to sell, provide services for pay. Oftentimes, each country will have specific words that they use to mean this kind of casual work. So it's important to include them here so people react, recognize them. So if they say yes, employed, then you ask them, or did you have a paid job or a business activity, but you were absent last week, temporarily absent? If they say yes, they're still employed, they were just absent. Then you ask them, did you help without pay in a family business? This is important because often we miss the contributing family workers, and they will say yes. So then they go to employment. And then if they say, no, I did not do anything that generated income, not even for 1 hour, then we can ask them the questions about a job search and availability to identify the unemployed. So job search is in the last 4 weeks. Did you look for pay or try to start a business? If it's a yes or no, then we can try to ask them if they say yes or no, we can ask them if an opportunity became available, could they start working within the next 2 hours? This is the availability question. And this allows us to identify 2 groups, the unemployed and the potential labor force. And then of course, then what they're doing if they're not seeking work or so on. So this is the minimal sequence, absolutely the super minimum. Usually you will see many more questions, but this is what will give you the labor force status of the person. And that way we can identify foreign-born and their labor force status. So that's the minimum that you would do to identify this population in a survey. Then you have all the employment characteristics. Maybe I stop here before we go to the next one. In case any questions on how to identify immigrants in the labor force.
Thank you, Lisa. I mean, there is a silence in the chat, so either everybody is lost or if everything is clear. So again, I do renew, dear participants, if you have any. Again, I understand that maybe this is dense and you need some time to digest it, which is totally fine. So there is no issue. Of course, you all have various expertise, so it's completely normal if you need a little bit of time to digest. In any case, please, if there is anything that's not clear for you, take the floor, or of course post in the chat, and we'll be happy to clarify it or to answer any question you might have.
Thank you. So I continue with the next one. So that's for immigrants. Then if you're wanting to capture your return migrants that have employment experience abroad, let's remember who are our return migrants with employment experience abroad. They're native-born persons of working age that are residing in the country at the moment of the survey, who had ever or over a specified period in the past resided and worked in another country. So they've been abroad, they lived abroad, they worked abroad, and now they're back living in the country. So what kind of data collection items we need? We need to confirm that they're usual residents. We need to know if they were born in the country, so native born. We need to know if they have ever lived abroad. So the question on ever resided abroad. And then we need to know if they were employed at some point in their destination country. That's the minimum. The red is the minimum. Of course, we want to know where they went. So we want to know what was their destination country. We want to know why they went there. We want to know if they had any employment experience anywhere else, how long they've been working abroad, and the characteristics of their most recent job, occupation, industry, status in employment, and when they return, and their intentions too. So of course you can always get more information in a survey, but the minimum would be those in red. So how would a questionnaire look like? So usually this is asked to the current household members. These are usually residents, so you already know from the start that they're residing in the country. And you have already asked them if they were born in the country, because we just saw those previous questions. So now if they're native born, then you send them to a module where you ask them, have you ever lived outside the country for more than 6 months or 12 months or months? This will depend on the concept of usual residence that the country use. So if they say yes, that's a person who is a return migrant. They've lived abroad, they've come back. If they say no, then you can try to recover. We'll look at that. But if they say yes, okay, then you ask them, in which country did you last live for more than 6 months or 12 months? Again, the concept of usual residence. they'll let you know the country, and you ask them why they went to that country, what was the main reason to move to that country. And here again, we identify the reasons that are work-related, so take up a job because I was transferred, to look for work, separate from other important reasons to study, family or marriage, health reasons, displacement, so on. And then those who take up employment, those who said they went for employment for work reasons, we have a hint that they might have employment experience abroad. But maybe those who didn't, maybe they went for studies, for marriage, but they might have also worked. So then we have to try to recover them and ask them, while living in your last destination country, did you also work or look for work? And that way we recover people that went for other reasons, but also worked. So this helps us identify the persons who are likely to have had employment experience abroad. We know they're return migrants, but now we want to find those who had employment experience abroad. Of course, the questions, once we start asking questions about employment, so while living, did you also work or look for work? We're asking them to those who are above 15 years of age. So once we identify those who told us, yes, I went for work, or yes, I looked for work while I was away, while I was abroad, then we ask them when they moved to that country, for how long they worked in the country. So maybe they went, they looked for work, but they actually didn't work. So you want to have options for those. And then you capture sort of the total duration of employment in the country. And then you can have confirmations of when they started working and a few other characteristics. So this way we can get information on the duration of employment, but also the duration of stay in the country abroad. Maybe you need to recover some people, because the people who say that they didn't work in the country, ultimately, you can still check if they went anywhere else to look for work. And so you can recover people who have employment experience, but not in the last country of destination. So a little bit tricky, but you get your core group. And then if you want to identify those who might have employment experience, but just not in the last country, then you can still recover them. That's optional. And then once you identify the people who said, yes, I worked abroad and I've worked for so many years and so on, then you focus on their characteristics of the most recent job abroad. So what kind of work did you do? Your occupation, what was the main activity of the place where you work, your main activity, and you can include questions similar to what you would do in a labor force survey for them about the last job abroad. Then you want to know a little bit about the return experience and why they came back and whether they're planning to stay. So then you can ask them, when did they last come back to the country? And then what was the main reason to come back? And when you ask about the reason to come back, you again separate reasons that are related to a job, because now I have a job to take back here, I was sent back, or I'm going to start my business back at home, or I lost my job, or my job ended, or I retired, separate from other reasons for return. And then you can have other questions around whether you're expecting to go back to the destination country. Many countries have circular migration where persons come back, stay for a period of time, and then go back out. So then you can try to identify that group with a question on expectations to return to the destination country. Now, that's to identify return migrant workers and their employment characteristics, something about their migration experience. All sufficient information to do a really sound analysis of their employment experience, the duration of experience, but also the reasons why they're coming back, and whether you can have expectations that how many of those will try to go back out again. Also important, if you want to look at policies of reintegration, in addition to knowing whether they're intending to depart or stay, is to have information on what they're currently doing in the country. So you want to make sure that these persons have also gone to the models that talk about whether they're employed, unemployed, or the potential labor force. So that's the labor force status sequence that we saw earlier. So you want to also have all of the native-born persons go through these questions, so you can look at, for those who have ever been abroad and are back, what are they doing now? How can we help them reintegrate, given that they have all these skills earned, built while working abroad? That's the second group. Before I move to the third one, I guess I ask again, Mostafa, in case there are any questions.
Thank you, Elise. I'm giving you, of course, the floor to explain a little bit more the situation. No, we had an interesting input from our participant Laila in the chat. She was saying that they are preparing the phase of the NLFS questionnaire with the ILO guidelines. I don't know, maybe if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, Laila, if of course you can have the floor, if you would like to share with us a bit through reflecting on Elisa's presentation. Other, if you would like to reflect a bit more, would be happy to have some intervention.
Which country could I ask?
Yeah, if you can also clarify, please, that would be good. Nepal, Nepal,
Excellent.
indeed.
And Peter is here with us, who
And
is
Peter is
our
here with us, actually. So
statistician
Peter,
covering the region. And
indeed,
with Nepal, we had a specialized migration survey on return migrants and recruitment costs. So maybe Peter can also talk about this next week, because Nepal has a lot of experience in this area, and we have been accompanying that process and also learning from that process. So thank you for letting us know that you're also moving to the LFS survey now.
I see Peter put on the video. Do you? Yeah, she's like saying that Peter knows about the NLFS development. Peter, anything you'd like to add in that regard? If you can just unmute yourself.
No, we'll talk about that on Thursday. So we'll
Okay.
share that on Thursday. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and of course, thank you
Thank
for
you.
all your efforts with our with our constituents in South Asia and Nepal particularly.
Yeah,
There is a
and
question in the chat. Do you want to
sure.
say? Did you want to add something, Elise?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say, because I know we also have colleagues from Vanuatu in the course,
We do.
and the Vanuatu implemented their labor force survey and added a module on return migrants. And we are, the statistics office has reached out to us to help them with the analysis. So we hope early next year to be able to support them in that as well.
I do know that there are a couple of them in the webinar. I mean, one of the main reasons to do the webinar so early was actually to accommodate to the Pacific. So I do hope that we should have a full participation actually. Anyone from Vanuatu would like to add in that regard from our participants? You are also, of course, you have the group project in which we made a group only of participants from Vanuatu, Elisa. So I do hope that they will elaborate more. But of course, if you'd like to add to the discussion, please take the floor. In the meantime, there is a question from our participant Orchidia. So, quoting, is it a common practice to use records from the Public Employment Service or Social Security to help create representative samples of the migrant population?
Very interesting question. So there are countries that use Social Security records in different ways to combine them with surveys. Usually, what you will have is more, not necessarily to make them more representative that I know of, but to add information on Social Security coverage when they can link. If the survey allows to link with an administrative record, then the Social Security is an important source. But also to confirm, because sometimes we have information that the persons say that they are employed, but then we need to see them in the Social Security if they're contributing. So they can serve to confirm employment and to also identify those who have coverage. So I've seen it used that way. I haven't seen it used for what you can also see, but it depends. It's more for countries where you have more formal economies, that it will be used to validate basically data. Usually what is used in terms of administrative records, and you will have a session on administrative records data, they're used as usually more population registers that will be used as sampling frames or to improve targeting of areas. And the Social Security is more used for confirming that the persons are employed and to look at their Social Security coverages.
Thank you, Elisa. I hope this answers your question, Orchidia. Of course, please feel free to take the floor if you'd like to add in that regard. Of course, we'd be happy to hear. I'm seeing a comment from Esther. Our team at our Department of Labor can provide insight on this. Please go ahead if you'd like to take the floor, Esther. or if another team member would like to. In any case, you will need to take the floor in the group presentation. So if you don't want to take the floor now, you will have to take it eventually. Anyway, Elisa, I know you still have a small bit to cover and we're approaching time. So let's try to tackle that last bit on immigrants, and then we maybe take a final round later.
Yeah, I think there are
Thank
two
you.
final groups that can be covered through a household survey. So we have the immigrants with employment experience abroad. Again, as I said, we cannot capture all immigrants because those who leave the whole household, then we have nobody in the country of origin that we can interview and ask questions about. So we can only capture the households that are in the country who have members who have left the country in a particular period. And so that still is the main source that we can use right now from household surveys to identify, to have information about immigrants, those who have still households left in the country. And so we can ask some questions to them to identify. This is usually a separate module asked to the head of household or one reference person. We ask them, the main question that we need to have is whether there are any former household members who left the country within a particular period and have not come back. And if the person says yes, then we ask them, can you tell me their names? And they fill out a new roster where they put the names, and then they capture their basic sociodemographics, their age, sex, education level, the year when they departed, where they went, the country that they went to, the reason for a move, and whether they know if they are employed in the destination country. Now, this is information from the household that is left behind. So sometimes they will know, sometimes they might not know. But at a minimum, you can ask them those questions. And then if you can have some information about occupation and industry, then that is very useful. The minimum to identify them is reporting that there are household members who left and have not come back, and then whether they have employment in the destination country. If immigrants do tend to come back to visit, so they're not returning to the country to stay, but to visit, then you could target the survey at the time when they are often visiting because it's a period of celebrations or holiday, and then you can actually interview them. So you can time this. There are also some countries that are asking the households for the contact number of the immigrants, and then they call them to interview them abroad. This is something that is done by the Philippines. We've also learned that it was done in Tunisia. And so there are a number of countries where they know that migrants retain close contact with their households of origin. Then you can request for phones and call them to interview. So an example, this is an example of a roster that would be added to a survey where you're asking the head of the household in the last 5 years. So you have to put a reference period that is fairly short, last 5 or 10 years at most. Otherwise, the likelihood that people remember then starts going. So in the last 5 years, has any former member of this household left to live abroad for at least 12 months or the duration of residence and is still living abroad now? Important to make sure that they have left the household and are still living abroad. Otherwise, they're not immigrants. And if yes, then as I said, you write their names and you've covered their sex, age, year of departure, country of living, and the reasons, and then whether they're employed, their occupation. So that's the immigrant module. Many countries do try to cover it, and so they can have some sense about how many households have immigrant members outside. We have one last group that we can try to cover through household surveys, and these are the residents that are living in the country but working abroad. So they are going for short periods at a time out of the country. So the definition, if you remember, we're talking about residents of working age. Doesn't matter if they're born in the country or not, or if they have citizenship or not. The point is that they're living in the country as residents who, or during a specified period, were temporarily absent from the country and working in a unit, also basically for an employer or in a producer unit that is located in another country. So you can imagine frontier workers, seasonal workers, cross-border service suppliers, these type of persons that are coming and going back and forth, but they retain a household where they're usually resident in the country. So what do we need for this group? Oh, here. We need to know that they are residents of the country. information about their place of birth or citizenship, whether they were employed in a particular period, the characteristics of the job, and very importantly, what the location, what country is that place of work located in. And with that, we can identify that they are residents, but that they're employed in an economic unit that is in another country. So this is usually included as part of the sequence of questions on the characteristics of the job. Now, this will capture those who are at the time of the survey having that job. So it's more suitable for frontier workers or persons where this is a regular situation during the year. So you ask them what is the main activity at the place where you work and in which location is this place. So you can capture whether it's within the country. So you have also those that are commuting within the country, but then those who are crossing borders to work in another country. So this is a simple one question that can be added in a standard labor force survey to identify these people. There's a second alternative. This should have said alternative 2. And this is asking, as part of the question that asked about ever resided abroad. So you have all your residents, you're asking them, have you ever lived outside the country? You can have a recovery for those who said they haven't lived outside the country. You can ask them, have you ever traveled outside the country to work or look for work, even if only for a short period? So they already told you they have not lived abroad, but now they said, well, you haven't lived abroad, but have you gone abroad for a short period to work or look for work? If they say yes, then you can capture their characteristics. So this is suitable to ask retrospectively whether over a particular period, people have gone outside the country to work for a short period and come back. This is more suitable for seasonal workers and others that might go for short periods at a time abroad. So it might not be current employment, but it's in the past year, in the past 5 years. So these are the two sequences. There's also interest sometimes in looking at whether residents are looking for jobs abroad. This, you can put it as part of your questions on job search. So when you're looking for people who are unemployed, you can ask them whether they try to look for work in the country or in another country. Are they looking to make arrangements in another country? And then when are they available? So you can basically ask to those who are looking for jobs, are you looking for a job in the country or abroad? And that way you can identify those who might be looking for work abroad. So suitable for labor force surveys as well. So just some summary points. I hope, I know it's dense, I know there's a lot of elements to it, but I hope it's been helpful for you to see the value of national household surveys for statistics on international labor migration. They can be a core source, and some countries do use them this way. But if you need to ask the questions on migration first, because you need to identify these populations, but that's not enough to get good quality data. If you need good quality data, then you need to see whether that survey covers migrants well, whether the design allows you to have sufficient cases so that you can have reliable and unbiased estimates. So that means you have to look at the design of the household survey as well. The best is a specialized migration survey because they're designed specifically for migrants. But, and if this is a topic that is a national priority in your country, then it's important that specialized migration surveys be part of the statistical plan. The countries have statistical plans that are usually 5-year statistical plans, 5 to 10 years. Think about in your country, making sure that this is considered part of the statistical plan if it's a priority in your country, so that it can be budgeted, because otherwise then it's a very difficult thing to get statistics on these groups. You can consider your labor force survey. It is important because it's the survey that deals with labor issues and they're already established, but you need to make sure that the sample design will support it. Otherwise, you can ask the questions and then you will be frustrated when you cannot analyze the data or use it to report. When would you plan a specialized migration survey or a redesign of an LFS? For that, you need to know where migrants are located, so you need a frame. So the best time is after your population census, because you update your frame, your country updates your frame, and then you can design a survey that targets migrants. So often it's good to consider either the post-population census or when you have the intercensal. Countries have something called the intercensal at the 5-year, this is a population count, and there you could also try to target, because then you have good information about where migrants are located. So I hope this gives you an overview. I know there's a lot of content, but I remain available in case of any questions. Thank you. Back to you, Mostafa.
Thank you, Lisa. No, of course, I'm very aware of that, and I know that probably I would advise everyone, if possible, if they have the time to watch the session. Again, you cannot do a measurement or an analysis of a survey without covering issues like sampling, like understanding return migrants, immigrants, migrant populations, priority groups, and all the aspects that Elisa covered today. So we do understand that it's quite technical, but at the same time, you cannot really make a proper analysis if you do not include all these aspects. Of course, you all engage with the topic of migration in a different way. Some of you are more producers, some of you are more users, some of you are employers, like our participant from Vanuatu who was writing in the chat about the experience and the kind of data that they work on analyzing from an employer standpoint. But in the end of the day, it's important to understand the process and to make sure to take all these nuances and caveats into your understanding and comprehension of what we mean by measuring and analyzing labor migration.
Let me, Mostafa, I see the comment by Esther, and I do want to talk about it because it's important. So thank you, Esther, for sharing that you have done skill surveys on tourism and construction due to shortage of skills. And I think what is very important, what you're saying is the sector-specific surveys are super important because, as you say, migrants are not generally going to all industries, all sectors, and not all sectors have gaps where you're trying to fill them in. So surveys that target sector-specific areas, then they can really be designed to also take account of the characteristics of the sector. And so we do see, and we are starting to recommend that, because otherwise, even in general household surveys, including migration general household surveys, you don't get the level of detail that you need or the type of information that is appropriate. So for example, fishing sector, construction sector, all of these sectors have very specific characteristics. And so, yes, it's an important point that sector-specific surveys are important in the context of migration. Thank you. Back to you, Mostafa.
Thank you, Lisa. I don't know if Esther, you want to add anything there, unless otherwise, you can always feel free to take the microphone. And I do encourage everyone as much as possible to have a microphone in the webinars, or to be able to have the ability to intervene with your own voice, because I think it adds a lot of insight, and we're always happy to hear your comments. So I would always advise to try to make available a microphone. I did ask in the chat if anybody has a question or if you'd like to raise your hand. I guess so far I haven't seen any inputs. So Elisa, maybe we can wrap up. We call it a day. I don't know if there is anything you'd like to add in the end, Elisa, before we wrap up the session. If anything you'd like to add.
Well, I'll be very curious to learn what you decide to do in the projects, because I think there are, so try to take a look also at the instruments, the source of instruments, not just the data, because oftentimes you need to understand how the data was collected to be able to say how the quality of it, what kind of interpretations you can make. And that also helps you see where do we need to do improvements so that the next round, this survey or this census or this source is implemented, that it will collect the data that you need insights on in a way that improves quality. So thank you for that.
Thank you indeed, Lisa, for the presentation. Again, I do invite everybody to review the presentation, and hopefully, of course, if you have any questions, you always have the forum, and you can always use the forum and make sure to convey your questions to Elisa. I think today's session, in a way, links to Thursday with Peter. We're going to be talking about recruitment costs. And I think, again, these are all important surveys and important sources of data for all of you for a comprehensive analysis of labor migration. So again, they are technical, but believe me, when you also put that into practice with the group project, it will make more sense. We are going to be in touch with all of you regarding the group project between today and tomorrow. I'm going to with Roseanne to make sure that everyone is progressing. And of course, if you have any needs, you can always reach out to us for any questions. So in the end, I would like to thank Elisa for summing up what is an extremely complicated topic in an hour and a half: household surveys, sampling of migrant populations, a lot of topics that we could cover over a good couple of days in a face-to-face training. So Elisa, thank you indeed for this. Of course, thank you for all of you for joining in. My gratitude as well always for my colleague Hisham for his support, and of course for all of you for participating. We will see you all, inshallah, Thursday, same hour at 8 in the morning. I thank you all, and we will be in touch in the coming days. Take care. Have a good day,
Have a good
everyone.
rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.